here today. Today's topic is going to be about diabetes. Yes, let's pick up diabetes. All right, the disease diabetes. We're going to cover this topic over a few videos. I would say two or maybe at most three. Since people do not like too long videos, we're going to just cut it down to three. So how we're going to break that down is going to be the first video, which is this one, is going to be about the definition of type 2 diabetes, diabetes in general, and then type 2 diabetes as a disease. Now, we have to do this in order for us to know what we are actually exactly talking about. I mean, everybody has some kind of an idea what diabetes is, know people who have diabetes and things like that. But let's be sure, when I'm saying something, you should understand exactly what I'm talking about based on these definitions. So again, very important to begin with definitions so everyone is on the same page. Okay, then we're going to go to statistics on the further videos. We talk about the statistics, how it's spreading, how it's increasing, not spreading, but how it's increasing over time, what is being done, some information about that. And then we're going to talk about the complications, and then we're going to round up with what we can do to prevent diabetes. That's the whole point of our video series, right? Raise awareness about diseases, especially chronic lifestyle related diseases, what we can do to prevent these diseases, and then if we even have the diseases, how we are going to behave, how we're going to conduct our life in order to reverse, in most cases, lifestyle related diseases can be reversed, reverse these diseases, improve on the conditions, and even, completely heal ourselves. Okay, so let's begin. Let's begin with a simple definition of diabetes. What is diabetes? You look in different books, they will give you all kinds of different approaches to the definition, or just say what the symptoms are. Actually, the very simple definition of diabetes is the inappropriate use or metabolism of glucose. Now you'd say, what is glucose? Well, glucose is a sugar. It's the smallest unit of sugar, of some sugars that can be used as energy in the body. Okay? Glucose is used in the body as energy. It is the preferred source of energy for most of the cells in the body. We're going to define a couple of things. We're just going to grossly talk about cells and bring in analogies so you understand what this means. I mean, those people who are not biology background and do not really know what these terms mean, as you all know, medicine and biology has its own lingo. So we're going to bring in analogies which represent what this really means in real life. And then we are going to talk about certain organs in the body, specific organs we're going to zoom in on. We're going to talk about the brain, we'll talk about the pancreas, we'll talk about the liver, and we'll talk about the muscles, and the blood, of course, the circulatory system. We're going to bring in analogies so you understand what we're talking about. Okay, we say glucose is the smallest unit of sugars, and sugars belong to the big category of carbohydrates, right? There are smaller units of carbohydrates that have been broken down. So when we eat our food, it gets into the stomach, into the intestines, they begin to be broken down to molecules, smaller molecules, such as smaller sugars, and then also broken down to glucose. Glucose and some other smaller types of sugars can be absorbed into the blood. So now your food that was in the gastrointestinal tract gets into the blood after it has been broken down to these smaller molecules. Okay, so once you have eaten something carbohydrate or even some other types of foods, macromolecules, they get absorbed, they get broken down in the gastrointestinal tract, and then to smaller molecules that can be absorbed into the blood. So the blood, what is the blood? We're going to talk about circulatory system, right? These are important organs that are going to be important in this disease. They're going to come up every so often, so it's good you remember what they do. So your small molecules of sugars are broken down so that they can be absorbed into the blood, small sugars, right? These are your carbohydrates that have been broken down into small sugars. Glucose is one of these simple types of sugars, and it's the preferred energy molecule of the body. The body needs energy, correct? So glucose, carbohydrates broken down into small units of sugars, including glucose, are going to be absorbed in the blood. They get into the blood from the gastrointestinal tract into the blood. Once in the blood, the level of the amount of sugar in the blood is going to increase. This amount of sugar in the blood, this increase, signals the brain to tell this other organ that I've just named, the pancreas, to release a hormone called insulin. Are you with me? Keep following me. Now the brain is the all-powerful center that recognizes that, that sends out decisions, senses things, and sends out decision on what happens in the body. You all know that. Okay. The pancreas, it's a small organ. It's like slippers that lies underneath, to the left, underneath the stomach. So the brain will send out message through the blood to the pancreas to release insulin once the blood sugar, specifically once there is high levels of sugar in the blood, including glucose. So the pancreas now gets this message and produce insulin. Insulin's function is to open doors of cells to let in glucose. Let me repeat that. Insulin's function is to open the door of cells to let the glucose molecules into the cell. Now, let's bring in our analogies at this point so that this makes things clear. I've talked about organs, I've talked about cells, okay? So the body is made of organs. As you know, each organ has a specific function and they perform these functions. The basic unit of these functions within the cell, within the body, is called the cell. So every organ has its own types of cells that perform the function of this of that organ, okay? So now, I've just said insulin opens the door of the cell so that glucose can get in. Let's bring in our analogies. Now, think about this. If you have, so what the cell is like a factory, okay? It's a factory, and you all knows what factory does, yeah? A factory might be producing anything. Say a factory makes, let's take the simplest one. A factory is responsible for making some chocolates, for example. So you're going to have chocolate, cocoa. Chocolates are made from cocoa. You're going to have a cocoa fruit that you get, that is harvested from a tree, gets shipped or sent to the factory. The cocoa is sent to the factory, and this transport medium is going to be similar to our blood. The blood transports the raw material. The raw material for your chocolate factory is cocoa. In this case, our raw material for energy is glucose. Okay. The blood transports. It's like a truck that brings in the cocoa plant, the cocoa fruit, and delivers it to the factory. So the doors of the factory have to be unlocked. Who does that? Insulin. So insulin is like the truck driver. The truck brings in the raw materials. It has a key. It opens the door of the factory and delivers its raw material to the factory. Insulin, in the transport medium, the truck is the blood, okay? It's transporting the glucose all over the body. So it gets to the cell, which is the factory. It has a key. Insulin opens the door, okay? Insulin is that truck driver that has a key to open the door. Opens the door and delivers raw materials. In this case, to produce energy. So glucose is delivered to cells in order to produce energy. Please guys, take note of the term lock and key. So the key to the cell, similar to the key to the factory. Okay, so the cell is a factory. It produces and manufactures a whole lot of things, one of which is the breakdown of glucose to produce energy. As I've said, glucose is the preferred sugar that is used in the body to produce energy, the preferred form of sugar used to produce energy. So everything gets broken down to glucose if it wants to be used as energy. If it has to be used as energy, some sugars will go into glucose, others will not. We'll talk about that later. Anyhow, glucose needs to get into the cell. It is the raw material and be fed into the machinery that will then produce energy. All right. Insulin is that responsible actor that should open the door to the cell to deliver this raw material. Now, follow me guys. If you have seen any kind of factory, if you have not seen any factory, you've got to look at one, at least one factory. In a factory, you have a machinery that produces something. Okay, look at anything. You have to know at least how the foods that you're putting in your mouth are being formed. Whether it's vinegar, apple cider vinegar. How is this made? Apples are the raw materials. They are going to be delivered into the factory. There is a machine that's going to either chop these apples into smaller sections and then liquefies these apples and then ferment it, and then eventually you have your apple cider vinegar. You've got to see a factory. Okay, so within the factory, there is a machine, a machinery, or series of machines that are going to do certain things in order to prepare the process and then eventually produce what you want to produce, right? In the case of our energy production, we have a machinery within this factory called the cell. There is a specific machinery that is going to produce energy. Okay, so your glucose comes through the door because of insulin, which has a key to unlock that door of the cell for glucose. So insulin delivers glucose. Glucose is put into some kind of it's a raw material. One side of the machine contains the glucose, and you can imagine it that there is a container to put in the glucose. The glucose is put in there, and then it gets processed, yeah, through a series of steps, and eventually in that machine, right? And eventually you have your product, which is energy. Okay, are you following me? Yes, right? Okay, so the cell is a factory. It has multiple different machines that are doing different things. In the case of glucose metabolism or use of glucose to produce energy, you have this specific machine. It has an input area where you input your glucose, and glucose gets processed over a series of steps through the machine, and at the end of that, out comes your energy. So now, insulin, who is the unlocker of the cell's door to deliver the raw material glucose, gets produced when there is a high level of glucose in the body, in the bloodstream. Okay, now that is the normal process. Insulin unlocks the door, sends in glucose as raw materials. Glucose gets processed through this machinery to form energy, and the body uses that energy. Everything we do needs energy, right? Moving my arms, I have to move muscles, it needs energy. Everything needs energy. So we produce energy from glucose, as I've just described. Okay, now if we are taking or intaking or eating way too much carbohydrates that are quickly going to be turned into blood sugar or glucose. Now, let me pause here and say, I've just told you that glucose is a form of sugar, the preferred form of sugar that gets utilized to produce energy by the body, right? So sometimes people just refer to blood glucose as blood sugar because it is a sugar. So we are going to be using these terms interchangeably. If you hear me say blood sugar, I'm referring to glucose for this particular video. We are talking about glucose and how it's being used. to produce energy, and why it can become ineffective, or the whole processing can become ineffective to create this disease called diabetes. Very important disease. Okay, so we have glucose in the blood going up. This will happen if we are eating especially direct processed sugars, or we're eating processed carbohydrates, because when you ground these carbohydrates, remove certain fibers from them and do certain things, process them, okay, they become easier to absorb. They turn quickly into sugar. And we will talk about glycemic load and all of that in the later videos. But there are certain carbohydrates that are going to turn fast into sugar, blood sugar, going really high. Okay, now, so if we are consuming a lot of carbohydrates that are going to be turned into sugar, especially processed carbohydrates. I'm talking here about white sugars, things that have a lot of white sugars, things that have a lot of white flour, things like that. All right, all of these are very highly processed carbohydrates. Fibers have been removed, things have been added, and now the body, it just turns immediately, almost immediately, to sugars. Some of these sugars, glucose. Okay, so as the amount of glucose is increasing within the body, the brain tells the pancreas, hey, produce more insulin. We have to take this sugar, this glucose, out of the bloodstream. A lot of it is not good. We'll get into that. So the pancreas now keeps putting out insulin. Okay, let me pause here and say, we are really describing type 2 diabetes. In type 1 diabetes is also a form of diabetes, that is the inappropriate use or metabolism of glucose. In type 1 diabetes, I'm just going to mention it here and then we'll keep it aside. In type 1 diabetes, the pancreas, that organ that needs to produce insulin, at some point stops producing insulin. There's a disease within the cells that produce insulin, and so it doesn't produce insulin anymore. That's type 1 diabetes. So you would see blood sugars are going to go up. There is no key to open the factory door in order to send in the raw material glucose into the cell to reduce the amount in blood. So you will need insulin. So these people are going to require insulin, that external application of insulin, because their bodies are not producing insulin anymore. So let's put type 1 diabetes aside. There is an autoimmune disease that has occurred in the pancreas, and now these people cannot produce insulin. Okay, they need insulin. Put them aside. We are now going to focus on type 2 diabetes. In type 2 diabetes, what has happened, or what happens? There is constant requirement of the pancreas to produce insulin. The reason being that there is high levels of glucose or sugars in the blood. So the brain is getting that signal. We're going to talk about feedback mechanism. The brain gets the signal immediately from the blood that there is high levels of sugar, and it sends message instantaneously to the pancreas to produce insulin. The pancreas produces the insulin, and the insulin should help unlock the door of the factory, which is the cell, and send in that glucose, and consequently reducing the levels of glucose in the blood. Now, if this is happening too much, guess what? Let's go back to our analogy, okay? So you are producing chocolate in the factory. You get deliveries. You are the cell. You get deliveries from from trucks that are bringing cocoa, constantly bringing cocoa. Okay, you take the cocoa, you put it in the input area of your machine, right? And now it's going to process. It takes time to process and produce energy, and then it keeps producing energy. At some point, your container that receives the cocoa is full. Now you get a little extra containers. You say, okay, sure, we'll save these ones here. Happens also in the cell, and I'll tell you when. You keep those there that you're going to use afterwards, and now your save containers are full.